edition of our BK Talks, the forum for discussion of the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment in Delft. Indeed, a very special occasion. It's an occasion we've been looking forward to for 1.5 years, obviously because we had planned to do this at the Biennale in Venice, but for the obvious reasons it had to be postponed. But now we can really have this live-streamed discussion, this session on a theme that we didn't know when we started to think about a contribution to the Biennale, or no, it was first an exhibition in our faculty. We didn't know yet that the theme of the Biennale would be, how will we live together? And the exhibition we first made in Delft 3 years ago, together with Marina Tabassum from Bangladesh, who unfortunately, again for the obvious reasons, is not able to join us, focuses on all the challenges the world faces, and we as architects, designers have to address. How can we give all the billions of people who are now living in the city or are moving towards the city a decent place to live, to work? And that's what we're going to discuss tonight in the beautiful space in Palazzo Moro where the exhibition is put up. And so I'm looking forward to this BK Talks.
Thank you, Dick. Good evening, everybody. It is really a pleasure for me to be here tonight. As Dick just mentioned, after 1.5 years not moving out of our homes, finally we can move out of our homes and talk about homes. So that's a great occasion. This is a topic that actually is a concern for all of us. It's been a concern of mine for a very long time, and I was really happy indeed to see that we were going to be talking about this in the Venice Biennale this year. For a very long time, I've worked on housing. I've edited several books about housing and about living together. And as editor or deputy editor of Domus in 2019, I did look at the future. We look at places like this. This is an image proposed by filmmakers in the United States about the future of Africa. I wonder if that's how Africa is going to look in the future, but maybe it's good that we reflect about it today. Probably we will talk about other things, about how do we deal with climate change and what will the cities look like if we increase capacity. You know, we're talking about 7 billion people living together. We will just give maybe way to nature, but that's maybe a look at in the future. I don't know if the future is going to be like, but what I know is that the future is the present today. It looks a little bit like this in some places. We are confronted to that. A series of urgencies. I'm not going to read them all, but I think you're all aware of the situation in which we are. So we really took care during that year at Domus of looking at how different places are addressing this current topic, which is what do you do with 7 million people, how to host them. We need, as we speak, 600 million homes. No? How do different countries address that topic? Collective housing mostly. What is actually adequate housing in one place probably is not adequate in other places. How do the up-and-coming powers in the world tackle that situation? How do cities are starting to look like? Or what do we do with immigrants? No? What is countries like Germany accepting millions of immigrants from not only Syria but probably Afghanistan in the coming months? What do other countries do about affordable housing? What's the situation in New York, where actually the biggest housing agency is not able to provide for new housing? No? So if you don't have the means, you probably need to live in a small modular containers. That's all you can afford. Or is that how affordable housing is going to be made in the future, done by private corporations? We also looked at other circumstances, like the city of Paris or France in general, where housing is more taken as a right, more than a product, or more than in other places. No? These are, let's say, the final forms that are taking place out of those politics, because politics, of course, are behind of all this housing that we are looking at. No? Or how do cities like Berlin look at cooperative housing? I guess that we will talk about something and many more topics today, but the reality is that We just saw really good examples of collective housing. The reality is actually that places that, like Azerbaijan, are building this. This is the collective housing being produced in Azerbaijan, but has to do maybe with other interests that are not exactly of the 7 billion we are addressing today. What's happening in Africa? How much efforts are being put in the fabrication of immense new towns that will probably never be completed. They are actually somehow products of speculation. So maybe we will also be looking at that today, or we will be thinking about that after this conversation. In the end, one of the things that I'm very concerned when we did this publication was that a lot of the housing we are looking at as designers at the faculties of architecture doesn't have anything to do with the bigger reality of the market, which is what you see in that slide, when you go to camp. And you see developers trying to show you images of a possible future which is not actually maybe the best of the models, that we want to see. But I would like to reflect on something. I would like, let's not forget, because maybe it's going to be better. Let's not forget to go to the bottom of the matter, to the bottom of the wishing well that housing represents to its residents. Do we really desire the housing that we design? Do we really want to live in the compact city? If we were to ask ourselves what the desired house really was, most of us would recognize that we have an ideal photo in mind. Suddenly, housing ceases to be a concept, something vital for the planet, ratios for judging plans. Suddenly, housing becomes an uncomfortable subject which could deeply affect our decisions. So if you believe in the city, make every house a desirable home. So today with us we have Nelson Mota, professor at the Faculty of Architecture of TU Delft, who will be moderating the panel together with Leslie, Francesco, Dick already said hello, Laura and Alessandro. I will give the word to Nelson, who has been working on this for quite a while already, so that you can please moderate the panel. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Javier. And indeed, Javier's presentation has already sort of set the background against which this discussion today will unfold. And some of the images are indeed, let's say, we could already sort of start the debate, I guess, but we won't do that because we still have 5 great panelists to also share with us some of their positions concerning the topic that we are all engaged with. And so this, the format for this discussion is going to be, so first we have, 5 minutes sort of statement from each of the panelists, and I will introduce them, of course, and then after the 5 introductory statements, we will then see what comes about in terms of discussion, and then we move on from there. So the first panelist, well, you already met him, is Dick van Gaameren. And of course, he also addressed you in his capacity as Dean of the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment in Delft. But of course, Dick has also been behind this global housing educational program, a program under which that we today were developed. But Dick is also, a designer, so he has, he started, we graduated in 1988 and he founded his own office, after working also in other offices, and since 2013 he's a partner in Meccano Architecten. And as a designer, he has also been involved in many housing projects, so he's highly qualified to talk about this. Many of them also awarded with prizes. And also, Dick, an important, I would say, part of Dick's production is connected with one project, the Embassy of the Netherlands in Addis Ababa, which I dare say that is to a certain extent the seed that germinated the global housing program, because after being involved and exposed to what was happening in Addis Ababa, Dick felt the need to bring these issues to the fore. And now in an institution like the TU Delft, as I assume in many others, this is something that should really be discussed. So it's quite, as Dick mentioned, quite coincidental that the theme of this Venice Biennale is how are we going to live together? Because indeed it's not the $1 million question, it's the 7 billion people question, right? So without further ado, I would ask, let's say, Dick to give his initial statement.
Thank you, Nelson. And indeed, before giving the floor to our guests, I want to just very briefly introduce what we have been doing in our global housing group, or study group as we like to call it. And indeed, I said it in the first word, it could not be more connected to the general theme of this Biennale, how will we live together? And now I have to see if I push the right button. This one? Yes. I did indeed push the wrong button. Well, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but you already saw this image flying by in the introduction of Javier. But this is, of course, this image poses already the question, how are we going to live together? If half or maybe less of the world lives in an apartment building looking over the self-built homes of those who cannot afford to live in one of these towers. And it's a very telling image, and indeed I think this is what we want to address with students in Delft at the faculty. Can we as architects find a response and find ways that also that everybody in this urban situation can live in a good way and together. And obviously this question connects to all the challenges we face, not just as architects, as designers, but we as a world. And in our faculty in the last 2 years we had several rounds of discussions. What are the themes, the challenges that unite us from all the different perspectives that we work from in our faculty, from a managerial or organizational perspective to really the actual design. And we said there are 3 things, and as a faculty of architecture and the built environment, we are completely connected to that. And maybe the most important one is that of urban inequality, and that is what the first image showed. And of course the climate crisis. And it's all connected, the growing scarcity of resources in every way you can think of resources. And I think in the issue of how can we create housing, good housing, affordable housing for the world, for the still urbanizing world, all these aspects come together. And that's why some 10, 12 years ago we started with students and researchers to focus on this question. Maybe at some point we thought in our own country, the Netherlands, that housing design was done, we had the right types and we could continue using them. We know by now that was a very wrong idea. But we also know that the challenges that we also face in the Netherlands are worldwide challenges, but that need cannot be solved just in one way. And so looking at housing all over the world is also for us to learn from. It's not that we think that the others should learn from us, but no, we want to learn from the other and other contexts, and that's the basic idea of our Global Housing Study Center. And we have 4 major, you could say, elements. It starts with exchange, because we think if we want to work and want to study these worldwide issues, we can't do it from our comfortable chairs in Delft and maybe just as a tourist paying a visit. No, we really have to do that with our partners worldwide. So, and the exhibition is here. We worked with our students in the context of Mumbai, of Dhaka in Bangladesh, Africa, Tema, Ethiopia. We do that with local faculties, local students, and local researchers. So it starts with meeting one another and exchange. So it's also telling students from India how our cities evolved. But at the same time, it's working in Mumbai with the students there and with our students on the issues that have to be addressed there. So that's education, but always connected to research. So we organize our global housing studios in these different parts of the world. We connect that to lectures. We always want to bring together experts from our part of the world, from Delft, with the part we are studying. And well, obviously, it was a difficult time the last 1.5 years not being able to travel. On the other hand, suddenly everybody experienced how easy it was, you know, to exchange ideas, to give lectures online. So we also got a lot of new information without being able to travel. And typically Delft, what we always do, we really try to understand what is happening now. For example, studying these amazing mass housing programs in India for our Mumbai studio. But not only trying to understand what's being built, but also trying to get an understanding of the discussion that is happening on housing. Some examples of, indeed, let's say, the very fierce debates in India on how to address the need for millions and millions of homes in the coming years. And then students start to develop their own ideas, and this is just one example, and in the exhibition many can be seen, of a project for an existing neighborhood in Addis Ababa or in Mumbai. And the research part goes, let's say, parallel to that, and we try to also publish that, like in this issue of Delft Architectural Studies on Housing, to collect all the knowledge and information and bring it to an audience as wide as possible. And as I said, bringing all these examples, what's happening worldwide, examples of how governments, but also, of course, NGOs or cooperations, because housing is a very complex thing with many aspects, but how that in different parts of the world is being addressed, from the large scale to the small scale intervention. And especially in comparing all these different contexts and different approaches, that's where we learn most from. Then, as I said, we want to, of course, share what we do, what the students come up with, what our researchers realize in their work by organizing events and exhibitions. Well, this is obviously a very good example of that, an event, but we have been doing that on a very regular basis in the last 8 years. We organize also debates in let's say, the countries we work with together. These are examples of an exhibition that we put up in Addis Ababa and invited representatives of the local government to start a discussion with them on all these issues related to housing. Exhibitions, we thought, just an example, the work of Charles Correa, very illuminating and something we can still learn a lot from. So in our great workshop in Delft, we had models made that then traveled through India in several venues to also start a discussion there. And also publications, obviously. And then finally, this year we launched an online course, a MOOC, a massive open online course that on housing design, which and I must say we are quite proud so that the whole world participated. You can see this in this map with most participants from India, but also from the States, from Turkey, from all over the world. And our maybe the final thing I want to say, and it's almost open, but not yet, is an online open platform for affordable dwelling that we called PAD, which let's say is a next endeavor to share what we collect in terms of knowledge and design proposals with the world as a whole. And with that, I would like to give the word back to Nelson.
Yes, thank you so much, Dick. Yeah, well, quite I mean, a very super interesting overview. And I just noted down that you mentioned a few times, well, the learning from approach, but also this, I mean, the idea that we need to understand and decode or unpack realities that are in many ways foreign to, I mean, to our eyes, to our gaze, and also this comparative approach. And that we are not going to debate now, but I'm just going to leave some little tips for the debate, because maybe you could also help us discussing a little bit what does the global housing mean, right? Because you also mentioned that all these realities are quite different, so they are very situated. So what happens in Dhaka is different from what happens in Mumbai, from what happens in Addis Ababa. So is there a sort of a global circumstance that we can, you know, operate with the same tools, with the same methods, or do we need then to address with the specifics? So I just leave it like that, okay, right? Yeah. So we don't need to engage in a conversation now. This is just some tips for further development. And with this, I move on to the next panelist, Laura Montedoro. And well, maybe Laura will also help us making sense of some of these challenges. Laura Montedoro is an architect and art historian and associate professor of urban planning in the Politecnico di Milano, in the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies, to which Laura currently serves as co-director. And Laura is also a member of the PAUI, Architectural, Urban and Interior Design, and member of the PhD board and the PIME Master and the PhD Scientific Program at the Faculty of Architecture and Planeamento Físico of Mozambique University, Eduardo Mondlane. So it's also interesting that in this case you have also been operating, let's say, on both hemispheres, let's put it like that, right? So from the north to the south and the other way around. So great to have you, Laura. So, well, please now the mic is yours.
Thank you. At first, thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and discuss of this very, very important issue and topic. So we know that 5 minutes are really very few to say something of importance, but I'll try to share with you just some thoughts that come from my experience of research in the global south, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa, in Mozambique especially, in the last 10 years. And I want to propose my thoughts, starting from a consideration about the legacy of the modern movement. Because we well know that for the architects of the modern architects, this idea of housing for all was like an obsession, a good obsession in my opinion, and especially during in the period, which is the is right, especially in the period between the two world wars, they work a lot on this topic, especially for the great cities of the global north that in that period were growing a lot. But we have even an important period of study and research on this idea of housing for all in the global south after the Second World, especially, for example, in the group of Team 10. And I think that this obsession could be very useful even today for us, because we know that we are immersed in this neoliberalist period in which we work in a very polarized scene and scenario, in which we have dramatic phenomena of gap in terms of rights, in terms of services, etc. So, starting from this point, of you, as architects, the question is, what can we do in this kind of scenario that depends, of course, on economies and politics for this kind of issue. And I think that we can start with these four ideas, urgency. The first one is try to govern, to have a government or to balance the rural and the urban territories, in both in terms of a more sustainable model for the expansion of the city, but even in terms of preserving the natural sources, because we know that today we have not a model that can work. And the second point is about the idea of learning from this context, from this territory, in trying to have capacity building in a reciprocal way. That is very, very important, to put ourselves in a position of listening, really, because we know that the need of the house is, of course, the basic need of a roof on the head, but living is more and more than this. And of course, we need to face with other kind of needs that are anthropological, traditional, cultural, etc. And it's not so easy for our point of view, of course, no, understand well this kind of context. And the third one is about the idea, the representation, the narrative, the storytelling of the informal cities or informal settlements that too often is represented as evil, as completely bad, while we know, or we know well that there's something to learn from the informal city, and we can even change the word to describe it. For example, some scholars propose the idea to call it vernacular and not more informal, to take off this negative label, no? And I think that this is a very important issue to interpret it in, from design point of view. And fourth and last but not least, I think that would be very important to promote and to improve a culture of maintenance, in order to make in value the great colonial heritage that today in these cities is abandoned or not completely used, but could be a good source for these cities. And so, just to conclude, my invitation is to come back to be obsessed by this idea of housing for all in the planet, but remaining urban-minded. Urban-minded, as said many years ago. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. Indeed, again, we see in your statements how different forces operate in this very complex landscape that we have been looking at. So you mentioned this global capital is shaping new territories, something that we have also seen in Javier's presentation, but also on the other hand, and you have been also working in this sort of rural-urban interface, and this is something that we also need to find new tools to be able to make sense of, right? Because this kind of sharp boundaries between the urban and the rural, which to a certain extent some people may associate with the project of, with the modernist project, trying to create very clear the functional division between, and all that. So actually we need now to make things a bit more muddled, right? So we need to be able also to recognize the qualities of what you also mentioned, the vernacular tradition, but also the formal city as a resource, and not necessarily something that needs to be eradicated and replaced by a completely different landscape altogether. So again, topics that I'm sure that will come back again in these statements, and if not, let's say we will come back to them in the debate. So I would like now to introduce Francesco Kiodeli. So Francesco is also an associate professor of urban and legal geography at University del Studi di Torino. So I think Francesco is also the right person to address the issue of the so-called informality or illegality, because he has been working on that for quite a long time. And so in Torino, Francesco is the director of Omero, the Interdepartmental Research Center for Urban Studies. And he has been dealing in his research with manifestations of illegality and informality in the urban sphere, but also focusing on housing questions with a particular attention, let's say. And but also working in different geographies, like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over Jerusalem and the adverse effects of special regulation. But I also know that you have been working in, let's say, in Africa, in many places, also trying to make sense of those very different realities. And so Francesco has published widely, and including Shaping Jerusalem, Special Planning, Politics and the Conflict, that came about in 2017, and co-edited The Illicit and the Illegal in Regional and Urban Governance and Development, Corrupt Places, that came about in 2018. So, Francesco, it's a pleasure to have you, and so now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Nelson, and his invitation. I guess I have to wait for my slides. Just to add something. Okay, let's start. This question is really scary. I mean, okay, so I'm not going to try to answer to this question in 5 minutes. So what I want to do is try to, let's say, to set the scene or the background for a sort of agreed background for trying to define the answer. And the point of departure is quite taken for granted, but I think it's nonetheless useful to remind it. I mean, housing precarity, let's call it this way, is a global phenomenon, obviously, which has multiple complex cases which differ in nature and scale, and obviously they are temporary and geographically situated. So the answer to the initial question cannot be single and simplistic. I mean, we don't have one-fits-all solution, and on the contrary, the answer is a puzzle. Okay, so I'm going to provide you some small pieces, meaningful, hopefully, of this puzzle. But another, let's say, point of departure of what I want to say is that we are here in an environment which calls us to the urgency of a housing precarity in the global south. But housing precarity is something also quite shared by several countries in the global north. This is a picture from Italy. I've been working a lot on Italy, and maybe you're not familiar with the Italian context, but just to provide you with one datum, which is exemplify the urgency of housing precarity in Italy. Currently, we have around 700,000 households on the waiting list for a public housing unit in Italy, which means that we have around 1 million something people waiting for the state helping them to find decent houses. So we have a big issue in Italy as well, and in many other Mediterranean and non-Mediterranean Western countries. So against this quite, let's say, depressing and dramatic background of the global phenomenon, I mean, the good news is that we know something, okay? We have been thinking about this issue at least since the 1950s and maybe 1970s a bit more. And in particular, we know what to do and what not to do in particular about in terms of housing, in terms of architecture, shari, and planning. For instance, we know that, finally, that self-help housing is not the problem, is the solution. Obviously, it's not the perfect solution, but we have to start from that. Even if then implementing this idea is quite complex, in particular in some countries where, for instance, non-clearance is still currently a policy approach to this kind of issue. However, what I'm more and more convinced is that even if we know something maybe a lot about how the realm of housing and urban planning. Problems are often architectural and urban planning in nature or urban design, but I'm quite convinced that solutions not often lie in architecture and planning. I mean, obviously problems are lack of decent housing, so it's an architectural problem, lack of basic infrastructure and facilities, an urban planning problem, but I'm not sure that let's say, the main solution can come from architecture and planning. I know I'm quite unpopular here, sorry.
No, no.
I mean, the point is like
we know
a
it.
discussion with you. I mean, if you think, for instance, to the centrality of legal problems in terms of housing, I'm not recalling, for instance, all the debate about the legalization and entitling the global south triggered by the Soto reason, but just think to Italy and how many problems of migrants are related to their legal status. So changing the legal status of migrants from irregular to regular is a way for helping them access a decent and a legal housing.
Yeah.
So I'm just stressing that in some cases architectural problems cannot be solved mainly by architectural or physical solution, but also legal solution can be important.
Yeah.
Obviously there are, I mean, also architectural planning can play a role, even if, and just mentioning one small thing, that some solution can come in particular from planning. This is my field. I'm not saying almost anything about architecture. I'm not an expert of. The point that seems to me quite important to stress is that in many cases what we should do in order to help find a solution is to reduce our, let's say, hand on question. This is a wonderful article I always mention by Shlomo Angel, is quite well-known scholar, which stressed the fact that in many cases we do too much in the global south. We plan too much. And he's proposing just to plan by an arterial grid of dirt roads. This is a provocation, but sometimes a reductionist approach to planning in the global south can be, let's say, a temporary solution, for instance, for allowing people to urbanize in a more decent way and with less constraints than in let's say, many master plan solution that we used to propose in the global south. Just to come to the conclusion, because I think I'm running out of my 5 minutes, the point, what is the point? That in the context of a very complex problem, planning and architecture and urban design can have a role. I think that this role is marginal, is not, let's say it makes sense, but it's, let's say, ancillary with respect to other, let's say, actions and let's say, solutions. So at this regard, if we want to find what is the core of the problems of this, or let's say of the solution, we can use the razor, Occam's razor in particular, which maybe is not the best solution, but can help us to get closer to one or the other. I mean, I think that in many cases, we don't lack knowledge. That's not a problem of bad planning or bad architecture. Basically, it could be a problem of lack of political will. It's an allocation problem of funds. Just to conclude with one example, if you think that in the last year, Italy has allocated around 20 billion euros to energy renewal of private building due to the pandemic. If you shift this money from the energy renovation of private building to public housing in Italy, you solve the problem of that million of people. So I think that we can do something. So the question is what we can do as a scholar and practitioner. I think that we can do maybe a small piece of the big puzzle of answering this question, but much more pieces can be added by politicians and policymakers, unfortunately. So the question is, how can we press policymakers and politicians to go in the right direction, right according to us, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesco. I don't think that it's such a provocative proposition, let's say, that architecture is not going to solve the problems of the world. So I think that we have sort of realized that. But it will be interesting to discuss and I think you already opened some doors to suggest that operating, or we need really to look into all the issues that are at stake from a multi-dimensional perspective. So it's not one-size-fits-all solutions never going to work. Just the perspective of architects is not going to work. But I would dare say that also, if we only leave these issues to be addressed by politicians or lawmakers, that's also not going to work. So probably we can try and discuss a little bit what will be the role of the different, as some people like to call it, the stakeholders in the whole process. But you also brought about something which I find really interesting, that we should probably come back to that in our debate, which is the question of where is the global south? Because also in many cases there is a kind of, people tend to look at this from a geographical perspective. But what you just showed now is that, I mean, there are many global souths in the North Hemisphere, and there are also many global norths in the South Hemisphere. And I'm not talking about Australia or New Zealand, right? And so this means that we also need to maybe reconceptualize a little bit what are the challenges of the global south and the global north by rethinking what is the global south and the global north, and even if it's worthwhile having this sort of differentiation. Well, just some food for thought. And on that note, let's say I move to a representative of the global south, even though, of course, Ghana is to the north of the equator, so officially it's still the North Hemisphere, right? Well, Leslie Loko, thank you so much for joining us in this panel. Well, Leslie hardly needs to be introduced. She has been, she's quite prolific in many of the things that she does and does well. But Leslie has been trained as an architect at the Bartlett School of Architecture. She holds a PhD in architecture from the University of London. And Leslie is also the founder and director of the African Futures Initiative in Accra, Ghana, which is an exciting new project, which is an independent postgraduate school of architecture and a public events platform. Leslie was the founder and director of the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg, where she was based from 2014 till 2019. Then to become the Dean of Architecture at the Bernard and then Spitzer School of Architecture in New York in 2019 and 2020. Leslie has been quite active writing. She was and also as an editor, the editor of White Papers, Black Marks, Race, Cultural Architecture, published in 2000, but also the editor-in-chief of Folio, the Journal of Contemporary African Architecture. And what also makes Leslie a quite special guest is that since 2004, Leslie made a transition from the academic to the novelists. And since then, Leslie has published the first novel, Sundowners, in 2004. And since then, 12 more bestsellers were published. So it's really, so I highly recommend ordering on Amazon or any other place. And let's put Leslie in the #1 top seller, okay, at least in Venice this week. Okay, there's so many things that we could talk about Leslie, and then finally maybe just mentioning that she's a founding member of the UN Habitat Council on Urban Initiatives, and also a member of the 17th International Jury of the Venice Biennale, which of course is happening as we speak, and a trustee of the London-based Architecture Foundation. So thank you so much for joining this, Leslie, and now it's time for your 5 minutes.
Great, well, thank you to Nelson and to TU Delft for this really kind invitation to come to Venice and take part in this really important conversation. When Nelson first wrote to me, I immediately said, well, I'd be delighted to take part, but my contribution will probably be a lot less grounded than you'd like. And he responded very graciously by saying he was sure it wouldn't matter, and I really hope he's right. We've been asked to make a short introductory position statement, but I would prefer to make several positions rather than one, mostly because the topic is so large, as many of my colleagues have said, that I find I hold contradictory views and positions depending on the angle. And the subtitle of today's event is housing, and I'm going to sketch out 4 positions. There's something about the number 4 that's, as you do in ballet, that refer to housing quite obliquely rather than directly. So in your opening statement, you describe the question, where is home, and what is home as apparently simple. I would argue that they are anything but. The German philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote that in circumstances of extremity, illuminations do not come from philosophical concepts, but from the uncertain, flickering, and often weak light that men and women kindle and shed over the lifespan given to them. This luminous space where they come out of their origins and reflect each other's sparks is the space of humanness, that sheds light on the world of appearances we inhabit. Its goal is not enlightenment or luminosity, not a quest for the blinding truth, but only for occasional lucidity and honesty. And so in the next 4 minutes, I would like to touch on the humanness of this topic, hoping for a moment of occasional lucidity. 2020 and 2021 are a circumstance of extremity. Our experience over the past 18 months has deepened the significance and the urgency of questions like how will we live together and what is a home. Taken as a whole, this year's Biennale, as well as today's event, is not simply a space in which we find ourselves, but a space that we purposefully construct together. That space, the lecture, the discussion, the exhibition, the competition, the publication, is the conceptual and literal home for these questions that we need to ask, as well as the answers that we hope to find. So the first position, the first definition of home, the place of safety, is an important one. And for those of you who've done ballet, that's the first position. Yep, I got it. Yep, perfect. So I'm going to ask to play the first video.
I think that the capacity to decide who can move and who can settle where and under what conditions might become the core of ongoing political struggles over sovereignty and nationalism, citizenship and identity, or, for that matter, security and freedom.
Second one. Second.
Government of human mobility might well be one of the most important problems to confront the world during the first half of the 21st century.
Okay, so I might need the lights again, but yeah, perfect. There's a couple more small videos, I'll tell you. So Mbembe's description of the government of human mobility being one of the most important problems confronting the world is particularly relevant because it refers not to just geographical mobility, but social, economic, class, and political mobility, which we loosely and sometimes myopically assume to be the natural byproduct of democracy. Beneath the impulse to move lies the desire to live a better life at home. Lights off for the next video. Thank you. Play.
May 25th, and the security cameras of this local restaurant are rolling. The indicated time is about 20 minutes past. A blue Mercedes has been parked curbside on East 38th Street for several minutes. We do not have footage showing when it arrived. George Floyd is in the driver's seat.
Thank you. Lights on, please. Perfect. The protests that followed George Floyd's murder swept around the globe so fast that most societies were caught off guard. Suddenly, a 300-year-old question, which has never been satisfactorily answered, was out on the streets from Baltimore to Bristol. Slavery uprooted millions from their homes. What does it take to make a new one? Can Africans in the diaspora ever truly consider themselves at home? And this is the last video. Thank you. Play. No, the video?
Yeah, it's coming.
Perfect, thank you. It doesn't work. I think you need to press play. Okay, thank you. There is sound on this video. Lights, please. Thank you. So this is a piece of student work from the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg by a student called Heidi Liu. I include it here because I want to say something about how a piece of work like this actually comes about. To make the space in which students can grapple meaningfully with difficult, complex issues about home, identity, race, migration, and displacement and so on, meant, at least in this case, that we had to dismantle an entire curriculum and rebuild it according to different principles. I come from a continent that is simultaneously the world's oldest and its youngest. The average age of contemporary Africans is just under 20 compared to almost 40 in Europe. Education is our battleground and our future. Opportunity, however it is defined, cannot always only exist elsewhere, particularly in the global north. The relationship between home and away is the key relationship, and it is the fault line of the 21st century. To confront, examine, and challenge that relationship, we need to understand one thing. The ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something we make and could just as easily make differently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I think that this sequence of videos, I mean, well, beautiful. I mean, well, the topics that are triggered by these videos are compelling, relevant, crucial, and urgent. I have to say that this last video, it's particularly moving because I was at a certain moment a bit confused where we were looking through the lenses of a microscope. So if we were looking into the real small, or if this would be a kind of, looking into a different planet or something like that. So, and that I think to a certain extent also, sort of inspires a follow-up to your, to the question of what is home. I mean, what is the the different scales of the relation. It's always struggle to say this word, relationality, right? So how do they relate with the different scales? What makes a home in context with race, where gender, where age, where all sorts of different backgrounds and cultural patterns influence what makes home a home. So is there a particular scale of operation that we need to be more focused, or is this indeed, let's say, we need really to keep our eyes wide open to be able to understand that and indeed try and make things differently? Well, let's keep this also on the, let's say, on our agenda for the debate, but indeed, a beautiful set of topics brought about your statement. So now, as we always say in these circumstances, last but not least, Alessandro Frigerio, also coming from the Politecnico Milano. Alessandro is an architect with a PhD as an urban and landscape designer. He's also a postdoc researcher and adjunct professor at Politecnico di Milano. So Politecnico is winning 2-2-1-1. So it's actually no draw. And also teaching the Master of Design for Development, Architecture, Urban Planning, and Heritage in the Global South. And Alessandro has been researching processes and special correlations of urban regeneration and sustainable urban development in its interscalar framework, so there you go, with a focus on integrated territorial planning, urban and public space design, and urban architecture. So you have also been quite actively working in, say, many places with a particular focus in Egypt, Kenya, Morocco, Mozambique, Somalia, South Africa, Tanzania, and Uganda. So I mean, you have already sort of, visited Africa in its multiple, geographies. Well, and you have also been collaborating and working with NGOs, private investors, and local governments. So welcome, Alessandro. Well, time for your first position statement.
Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. As you can understand from my introduction by Nelson, I've been quite active in sub-Saharan Africa in the last 10 years. So, as was mentioned, the topic is very broad, so I will try to go through the topic by telling you some stories about my experiences, trying to point out some particular issues, and especially starting from the same question, what is home? So I went to the very beginning of the drama of urbanization. So I'm showing you this beautiful place, which is in northern Uganda, close to Arua, which is a medium-sized city that is growing very fast. And when I was there for a project by Politecnico di Milano and UN Habitat, we had the chance to speak with local chiefs that were involved in defending customary tenorship of land. And their main worries was that especially young people, as soon as they were receiving land from the family, was selling the land to buy a motorbike, like the one in the picture, to become motor taxi drivers, and completely losing any safety net in regards to their future life. Because the motorbike in a few years would have been broken or sold or whatever, and they would have never had again a piece of land or a sort of anything that they could call a home. So he was basically saying, without land, any one of these guys is lost. And he's lost because when he has no safety and no home anymore, and he goes to find a home in a big city like Nairobi, this is a second story, he will probably not find any social and welfare system able to grant him a kind of home, even a cultural system able to grant him a kind of home. So he will probably settle in an informal settlement with a very poor condition in terms of living quality, environmental quality, and even if he would probably be offered, if he was very lucky, a social housing apartment, he would probably dislike it because he will be not in the mood, in the mindset, in his kind of way of perceiving home. So he will prefer to live in a vernacular system, a resilient system, instead of an efficient modernist social housing. And this will also trigger some dynamics of speculation, because probably the middle class will be more interested in living in this kind of apartments, and he will sublet the apartment to a middle class family living in this system and producing some sort of conflicts and fragilities in the social system of the city. And the preference for some kind of low settlements in many of these cities are producing landscapes like this. This is Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. 80 to 90% of the city is a sprawling, low-density system of houses, trying to reproduce some tribal and rural organization. But this kind of system are also very fragile in terms of answering to climate change and natural hazard. This is a picture from a huge flood that is happened seasonally, I have to say. But as the informal settlers building houses in these very dangerous places are every year relocated or affected by this kind of dangerous events, the city has no memory. So every year these floodplain locations are resettled by different people. And this idea of the memory of the city and the impossibility of the city to build this safety net through memory is something that I want also to point out. And also because the alternative is even in this case, something like this, which is completely different from the kind of living, also completely poor in terms of offer, also for the middle class. So it's the kind of quality of life is very complicated to be related to the cultural issues of populations. And in this case, it's even more complicated because people were evicted to build a new kind of settlements, but at the same time, the settlement took so long that the government, at a certain point, decided to build this social housing to replace the people that were waiting for more than 12 years to have a new house. But at the end, the government is granting the house just for 5 years, and then he said it's just trying to think about financial instruments and tools to grant these people to stay more than 5 years. So what about these people being a victim more than 12 years ago and now trying to understand how to build their safety net to have a proper house? So I want to go back to the idea that was already mentioned, that right to housing is not enough. I prefer to say right to inhabiting, and I think that this right is more related to a set of rights that include the right to the city, a right to landscape, also including ecological and environmental issues, but especially also a right to kind of lifestyle, which is an anthropological and cultural issue. So probably working about right to inhabiting is about strengthening the urban framework of the city, all together with all the system, and it's not just building houses. And this is something that I had the chance to study in some experiences in Mozambique, in example. Maputo is a very interesting laboratory about working on the existing and working on the upgrading of informal settlements and neighborhoods. And everything starts from recognizing land rights and working on the security of tenureship, because this is basically the first rerouting operation to allow people to invest in their house, and so also to provide for a possible densification of the city. Of course, this requires time. These are some of the examples of what is happening when land is secure, and so also little investor can start to upgrade the city, densifying, and also densifying, like doubling informal settlements could be a huge resource in terms of housing people through inner and endogenous dynamics. I worked on this in several occasions, working directly with community and especially through capacity development, like in Johannesburg with the Wits University and Polytechnico again, and several other actors. The idea is to work on the public structure of the city as the provider for the possibility to private mechanism to work for the densification of systems, and so the housing of many more. But in this idea of rerouting people, in the sense that the city has the ability to reroute people when the social system as a whole, it means like in a sense of community, is providing what a single piece of land cannot provide, because we cannot have any of us a little piece of land somewhere, but we can, through the sense of community, define this kind of routine. So my idea is related to a very Milanese concept, which is the one of continuity, which is from the 50s and 60s of our school, and Ernesto Nathan Rogers, is the idea that the city has to build on itself to provide this safety and this sense of home. Also to be inclusive towards the strangers, that can find in this idea of continuity a platform of confrontation and a platform of engagement. So these are a list of recommendations, but I don't want to get to this because it's already late. But my very last point is that what is very needed from us as architects and urban designers, it's working on imaginaries. Because it's true that maybe we don't have the financial resources, but it's also true that if we can provide alternative imaginaries, we can also move resources in a different way. So, and we need these imaginaries both for the informal city, but even for the kind of formal cities that we've seen also in the previous parts of this discussion, that are very poor in terms of quality as the informal one in a different way. So we need projects.
Yes, so thank you so much, Alessandro. And indeed, let's say you, in your statements, I could sort of recognize this, let's say, how can I put it, a certain comeback of John Turner's famous aphorism of that housing, should be seen as a process, not as a product, right? In that sense, let's say we should maybe, that that maybe also helps us indeed thinking about what is really housing and to what extent is housing something that is to be dealt with by our architects or by policymakers or by politicians and so on. But also you brought something which I think, which at least for me, something very important, which is the temporality, issues concerning time. Because to a certain extent, even some of the images that also Javier showed seem to be completely ignorant of the effect of time, right? Because the city, indeed, like I say, in the good old Milanese tradition, they are not just built by magic. So they take time. And what makes the city a city is probably the interaction of many aspects, humans, non-humans, nature, people. And in that sense, that also, there's this kind of incremental nature of that brings quality to the cities. And maybe I would just also leave on the air, let's say, in the air, this proposition of Gautam Ban, an Indian, let's say, a political scientist from India, that's talking about notes on southern urbanism. And he suggests there are three key concepts we should think of. One is looking again to squatting as something that can actually be an emancipatory practice. The other one is about repairing. And so this has been particularly quite successful. So the idea of repair. So again, not the one, just something that happens in one go, but something that develops through time. And finally, this idea of consolidating, so that also, again, things are not supposed just to remain pristine, forever. There's a, relentless process of repairing and consolidating that we need to take into account if we are to make housing a process and not a product. Well, these are all things that sort of popped in my mind, let's say, while you presented also this idea of the social ecological, or housing as a social ecological infrastructure, which also makes me think of Abdul Malik Simon's concept of people as infrastructure. So rather than speaking about pipes, electric wires, and sewage, all the sort of things, we should maybe refocus and look into people, and because people are really the infrastructure of cities, right? Not the pipes. Well, that's what Abdul Malik claims, and I tend to sympathize with that idea. Now, I guess that we can open the debate now with all these things, but now the problem is that I don't know what to ask because so many interesting things came about. But well, let's just try and go with something that could just trigger a nice conversation between you. And so one of the things, even so our title, BK Talk, 7 billion at home, housing in a fully urbanized planet. So again, this sounds really, let's say, ambitious. I mean, how are we going to address this issue? I mean, can we do that? So to what extent do you think that, let's say, we can make sense of these different scales? I mean, the global, but also the particular. So should we, let's say, trying to, stop with this nonsense of trying to be really generic about this issue and try to claim that we as architects or thinkers or scholars can bring some, remedy to the situation, and maybe we should just resort to our field of expertise, or maybe Leslie can write a beautiful book that does more than 32 master plans, or Dick, let's say, as dean of an educational institution, can create new conditions to to attract new ways of thinking about education on this topic, or you as researchers and also educators can also operate your little thing there. So I mean, in other words, maybe I would just start with that. So to a certain extent, is also discussing to what extent can we see this as a global phenomenon or a global issue of concern, or should we really try to get rid of this nonsense and just focus in very situated, very particular conditions? So how do you think that this can be addressed? And this, to a certain extent, also trying to respond to the provocation. Let's say, what is the role? what is our role in this conversation, right? Well, do you want to just volunteer to be the first, or should I ask you, like with the students, and nominate
We
a
have to
voluntary?
set a good example. We should nominate ourselves. Can I start?
Sure.
You know, when I came to study architecture quite late, so I had a degree in something else, and then I decided to do architecture. And of all the things I thought I was going to be, a translator was not one of them. I think I didn't understand, actually fundamentally architecture is about translation. And at a very practical level, it's the translation of I've said it many times, an idea into a drawing into a model into a building into a city, this constant shift. But when I started working in South Africa, I think it was the first time I understood that the question of translation went beyond the discipline. And we talk a lot about the global, but in a way I've become more sensitive to the idea of the universal. And for me that's the first problem, that a lot of the terminology in architecture assumes a universal understanding. And actually many of the things that we take for granted, the relationship between public and private and civic and inside and outside and home, these things actually have completely different meanings. And curiously, the training of an architect is a really good discipline to do that kind of translation. I think architects do it in really interesting ways, not just verbally or epistemologically, but also physically and materially. But so little of our training focuses on this idea of a translator. So there's something in this discrepancy for me between what we can do, what we are good at, and how we practice that is very relevant to this condition. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Leslie. Well, maybe maybe you would
Just
take,
go around the
yeah. Let's go there in a very democratic kind of sequence. Which is the geographical sequence. But Francesco, you can also, because I think to a certain extent you can maybe now articulate a little bit. Let's say, should we just start writing novels and just quit our profession because it's worthless and there's nothing we can do? Or is there something, let's say, that we can still
Okay, thank you.
contribute?
I try to articulate the answer to your two questions. The first is about the, let's say, the epistemic value of the approach to global issues, and the second is, let's say, getting out of a sort of nihilism that you can, read under the lines of my statement. I start from the first. I think that, there are pros and cons, obviously, of these using these macro categories in order to read the phenomena, urban phenomena in particular. I think that from one side is extremely useful to underline the global nature of some problems. In particular, let's say for the areas of the planet where these problems are less self-evident. In a sort of southern third, it's very interesting for us living in, let's say, so-called Western well-developed country to speak about the global phenomenon of housing, because usually in the public debate and also in the scholarly debate, we don't talk about these kind of questions. So from one side, I think that it is extremely important to have this kind of, let's say, panoramic approach to housing issues to stress the connections between different phenomena and different pace. At the same time, obviously, any kind of situation is contingent in time and space. So when we go in particular to look for some kind of solution, obviously we have to look at the specific institutional, cultural, social reality, as Alessandro was stressing very well. That kind of projects, let's say social public housing project, have been copied and pasted from the north to the south. We have been knowing for 30 years that they don't work in that place. We have several problems also in Italy, but for instance, in Italy they can work at a certain extent, while I think that in some African countries that's not the way to take. So there is always pros and cons of this kind of macro approach, but I think that we should be aware that mobilizing the concepts should also take with debate, also the need to specify and to make more contingent let's say the materialization of the concept. About what to do as planner and architects. Fortunately, I'm not an architect or planner, so Gaameren is up to you. I will say that, I think that our role as scholars, let's say, and practitioner, in some cases, is ancillary, but it's not irrelevant. Just
Thank you.
For instance, I was impressed by what Dick was explaining at the beginning in terms of the engagement of TU Delft with the housing.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I was in Cambridge waiting for the train, and I started to browse the website of a well-known school of architecture in northern Italy. I cannot say the name. And looking at the courses, there are around 120 courses, something like this, for the master program. There is no one single course on housing. Okay, so I think that as scholars, well aware of the importance of the housing question, we should also try to change our program, our teaching activity more towards the direction that you stresses. So more, let's say, awareness of the globality of this problem of housing, but also of the local materialization in Italy of this problem. At the same time, what is terribly lacking in Italy as well, I can talk about my country, is the difficulty of scholars to engage with public debate. This kind of issue never enter the public debate. We are very much, let's say, we like some kind of intellectual onanism. So, we cannot communicate, and it's a problem, because when we are discussing about the recovery plan, hundreds of billions of euros to be invested in the next year, no single words about housing. And this is a problem if we think that this is a global issue, but irrelevant issue also for our country. So I think that something can be done from the teaching viewpoint, but also to the viewpoint of public communication. So this event, for instance, is in line with, and also the Biennale of Venezia raising this topic. I mean, it's important, but it's simply the first step, I think, that we have to, of a long path that we have to run around.
Yeah. Thank you, Francesco. Dick, so maybe then you can help us unpacking what does the global housing mean for you, at least.
Well, I think, a lot of it has been said, also global, universal, but I think we use the word global that we think I explained it already, I think, that we can learn a lot from looking at different places, different contexts. So it's not to say that there's one global or universal solution, that would be the worst thing to say, but especially by really looking into how do people actually live, how do they use what's offered to them as a house, as a home, and then you see the differences, and it also opens your eyes to what's happening in your own context. And I think that's why we use the word global.
Yeah, and because Leslie also, brought about this idea of architecture as translation, right? So, for instance, every time that you are confronted with, a new reality, I mean, how do you translate that reality? Do you have any particular, mechanism that you use to try and make sense of that? I mean, to avoid running.
I think you would be able maybe to answer this better than me, because I think what is really one of our tools in the projects to what we call a kind of architectural ethnography, and we don't pretend to be ethnographers, but still really trying to map everyday life. And I think that is really, for us, but for our students, a big eye-opener. Not to think in square meters. You can think, okay, 21 square meters is the UN minimum, what is required for good home, so here we are. Yeah. It's really how can you use those 21 square meters in the most optimal way, and that's different all over the world. Yeah. And that's what we can try to understand.
Exactly. I would even dare to complement that, not only trying to make sense of how can we use those 21 square meters, but also to try and identify also what are the struggles and the challenges of living in 21 square meters or in 10 or in 100.
And related to all the aspects were mentioned, how does this relate to income generation, to the societal culture. How do people meet? It's not only about your private
No, exactly.
square meters.
Gender, race, and all that. Well, Laura, and so from your experience also, how do you navigate these different scales, the world's challenges?
Well, from my experience, I have the opportunity to notice that when we export our tools in terms of planning, for example, we risk a lot. And we need, of course, to work in another working in another context. We need to verify our tools and even to be available to change them in order to be effective for that context. But I have to say even that in my frequentation with institutions, for example, in Maputo or in other great cities, even Marrakesh, for example, you have a West culture of planning there. And so this is quite strange, because you come with an approach very open that says, well, but I want to change my approach, because I know that, for example, this kind of urban planning doesn't work even at my latitude, for example, no? Because in Italy we have a lot of plans that fail completely, while you are following this kind of model. So it's quite difficult to dialogue about this, because there's a different meaning that you give to the same action, to the same knowledge. So I found this quite strange,
Right.
because you have global attitude, but I'm sure that we need of a specific site projects and intervention. And more than this, I am more confident with very practical and if you want little projects that start with participation bottom up with the NGO, etc. Then with the big provision of municipality, district, region, because I observed that this orientation, this direction doesn't land, no? So you have always this great gap between the narrative and the real every life day of the people. So and I think that we would work on a dialogue and connection between these two levels more.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, and that maybe it's a nice, let's say, bridge to connect with Alessandro's notion of sensitive densification that you showed in your statement. You also showed in your slides this kind of polarity between the vernacular and modernity. Now, well, the first thing is that we could also, discuss is whether is there really a polarity? You can only be either, go with the vernacular or going with the modern. Let's say people can only need to choose whether they go and live in those multi-story flats or living in the informal settlements. Is there some sort of third way? And but also. That brings me also to, you mentioned participation, and then, I studied, a program of housing with citizens' participation in Portugal, in the 1970s, and one of the architects involved, there's an anecdote that he came to this community, and he was trying to engage, and he came to this community and said, well, here I am, tell me, what do you want me to do? So which house do you want me to design for you? And then the people, they turn to them and say, I mean, I don't know. I'm not an architect. I mean, which house do you live in? Well, I live in an apartment in this. Well, I want one just as yours. Yeah. So now the question is, because to what extent can we, let's say, also rethink ways of participation, not just as, you know, as like the planner or the policymaker or the architect is the hand of the people, let's say, in a kind of where you also sort of, you know, take away your responsibility as well, as a public intellectual or a technician or whatever it is, to achieve this sensitive densification. In other words, let's say, how do you actually can assess whether it's sensitive or not sensitive?
I would say,
Who decides that?
for sure, people living in can decide, but I was thinking about the role of architects, and despite the fact that our role is very limited, as Francesco was reminding us
Yes.
before,
Of
I
course.
think that our only way to have an effect is to be even more architects.
Architects,
Yeah, we should
technician.
be, more architect than we used to be, because especially dealing with these kind of issues, we tend to be fascinated by economics, social sciences, very specific knowledge is related to water management because we love now infrastructure, etc. And we forget that our role as architects is to be imaginative, and that's why I was closing my speech before like this. And our capability to be imaginative solves most of the issues that were mentioned. About participation, one of my teachers used to say that the people only ask what they already know. And so if you do a participatory project, probably they will just ask what they know. But our role is to show them what they don't know. So we have the
Translation is
we have
another
the
form of
responsibility
is
to
another form of
translate in different ways.
Yeah.
And
I think
about
so.
translation, our specificity is to show things in terms of images more than narrating them. And this is something that I experienced a lot during capacity development projects, both in Uganda and in Tanzania and Kenya. You spend a lot of time producing presentations, speeches, and trying to vehicle some theoretical knowledge to people that are completely far away from you. And then you show a simple image trying to show how things can be different through, I don't know if a render or just a sketch sometimes. And this can be very, very powerful. And it's just being an architect. So I'm just doing my work that generally I forget to do because they ask me a lot of other things, reports and Excel files and numbers.
Yeah.
But I think the only way to make a difference as an architect is being an architect.
Right, Dick.
No, I really agree. I also like, let's say, in your statement you ended, we need projects. And so maybe the conclusion should indeed be we need more architects. I don't say that because I'm the dean of an architecture school. But then architects as translators, because if you have one architect who designs a housing type and you think now I've solved it and the whole world can live in that's of course the other extreme, but we know that's leading to disaster. But it's also about scale. I was just thinking about, let's say, history of Dutch housing. So 120 years ago, a very influential new housing act was accepted by Parliament, showing that in the end, it's really about many other things. It's a political thing. But that led to the possibility for private people, private groups, to start a corporation, and that would be financed by the state. And incredible projects happened because they were done for a specific group of people, and the architects were really translating the needs of those people, like civil servants in a certain rank. They had their own corporation and their own architects. But of course, over time, scaling up, these housing corporations, they became so big that they lost the contact with the people they were building for. They were not translating anymore, but trying to find the most economic standard. And then things stop working. So we need We need a small scale, and we need a translation.
Yeah.
I agree
Yeah.
completely.
And yeah, I don't know if there's anyone that would like to follow up, because I think that we, on that note, let's say, maybe I will return to Leslie, because you have also been communicating using very different, say, media, right? I mean, when you write or you know, acting as an educator and exploring, for instance, we saw, you know, video, or you or your students, or architectural projects and all that. So that, just to pick up on this call to raise imagination, which I think it's a beautiful word, say, to maybe as one of the highest priorities that we need, let's say, to address question at stake. So, I mean, what do you have in mind, let's say, some, you know, suggestion for how to stimulate this imagination, not only for market, I mean, to raise the imagination to a higher level of the field of operation of educators, researchers, well, planners, architects, and all that. So is there something that we should now reconsider in terms of how we operate?
It's a really interesting question, and actually a very big question. And I'm going to answer it in a slightly anecdotal way. When I was in New York, I went to a meeting of the Harlem Greater Business Council or something. And there were some representatives from one of the universities that's slowly buying land in what was now, or what is now, southern Harlem, and the university is kind of moving northwards. And in the presentation that the university architects were making to this council, somebody mentioned the word, the Faculty of Climate. And it was just a sentence, and it went by and nobody really noticed it, but I kept thinking, what does he mean by the Faculty of Climate? And eventually I understood that it was almost a slip of the tongue, but this university was speculating with breaking down the traditional barriers of, you know, social sciences, Faculty of Law, Faculty of Medicine, you know, all of these constructs that we somehow think of as natural, and trying to rethink the structure of knowledge in a way that would produce different results. And somehow the ambition of that project made me really think part of our role now has to be to question so many of these inherited categories, because we talk all the time about wanting to be interdisciplinary and not to have silos and to think about things in a new way. But the structure of how we are trained, the structure of how we think is also its own, it has its own history. And to think beyond that is really hard. But at the same time, I think that the tools that the architects, and not just architects, but the tools that we're given are really useful tools for helping us to move beyond that, you know, to think beyond your imagination in a sense.
Yeah. And to a certain extent, I mean, if there is, let's say, a field of operations where that is absolutely crucial, is really thinking about, say, dwelling or housing or you know, or the issues that we have been addressing, right? Because that is really something that it's multi-dimensional, right? And multi-scalar as well. So in that sense, breaking those disciplinary silos or boundaries.
And also very, very scary.
Yes, indeed.
Because if you take away those certainties, what are we left with?
Yeah. And well, maybe I mean, I also I'm looking now to, of course, the audience here in the room, and and then we have 10 minutes more for this debate. So you are very welcome also to raise your arm and to ask a question to any of the panelists or one of the panelists if you wish to have a more direct question. So let me know. I don't see any raised arms, so we will continue the debate on this side of the letters. And so then let's then have this last 10 minutes maybe to Francesco, you talked also about this intellectual onanism, right? which I think is also quite interesting. And how have you, I mean, what are your experiences also, let's say, navigating through disciplines? Because I think you kept on saying, well, luckily I'm not an architect, as if that was it. But what does that really mean? I mean, in terms of, because you mentioned, let's say, how little any single discipline can do, right? But maybe you could share with us some, positive experience of collaboration or conflict, which is also quite useful to learn, because I think that your experience in terms of research could be quite illuminating on that note.
Thank you, Nelson, for this question. I mean, transdisciplinarity, I think it's based on my personal experience, but I think it's a shared need in terms of complex problems. So, but since your question is, I mean, it's quite also difficult to me to reply in just a few minutes. I want to skip your question.
That's fine.
To answer the previous question about imagination, or because I was thinking about what Alessandro said and Leslie replied about imagination, and I think it's really needed. I think that it's really important if we want to have solutions or ideas which fits with the temporal and the geographical contingency of a situation. At the same time, I mean, we have to recognize that we are using keywords, so participation, incrementalism, transdisciplinarity, which are 50, 60 years old, and this is not a bad thing. I mean, what it seems to me is that we have the knowledge, or partially some, let's say, a background of robust knowledge. The problem is implementation, because if we see this picture of public housing buildings nowadays built, and we have been knowing since 50 years that this is not the solution, the problem is not producing knowledge, so not only creative imagination for new solutions, which is needed, but also creative imagination how to implement old ideas which has been proven to be grounded and good. But at this one, I don't have the question, and so maybe I pass the ball how to implement. So switching from imagine to...
maybe this Biennale will give a kind of impulse to that. I only arrived yesterday evening, but I had a walk through the Arsenal, and you see so many ideas, projects that come back to the period you're describing. So, well, you could be cynical and say, oh, we all know that, but I think it's more or less clear that the time is there again to look at these ideas and now really start giving them more body.
Yeah. Laura.
I want to say something about the relationship between the disciplines that work on the territory that are very different. We know that we need a lot of skills, and of course as architects we can't control every activity. So I think that even in this case we have an issue of translation. Because, for example, in the work that we did in Maputo province with a lot of engineers, was really very difficult to push them to work on the idea of the space. We asked them for some maps of their scenarios that were very sophisticated about climate change, about scarcity, water scarcity, etc. Very, very interesting, but just numbers. And we asked them, please, try to build a map of these issues. It was really very difficult. So I think that we need to work even on this aspect of translation among our disciplines, because we know that today, even with the ecological challenge, we really need to learn to work with scientists and so different kind of people.
Yeah, right.
Justice.
And well, Alessandro, concluding remark. You can pick any of the questions mentioned.
I would say that probably this issue of translation has a lot to do with one activity that most of us also are engaged with, which is teaching.
Yeah,
and
of course.
one of the most important issues in finding alternative solutions in those kind of countries is that planning and architectural teaching in those countries is still very limited. So we have very few architects and planners that are from Africa. The ones that are now active were taught and learned planning 50, 40 years ago in the Anglo-Saxon system, so as Laura
Yeah.
was saying, the results are quite dangerous nowadays. So my expectation and my hope is that African schools can grow a lot, and I know that you are very engaged in this, so I look at your initiative with a lot of gratitude, and I was very, I found it very awesome when I read about it, so thank you for that. And one of my other hope and one of my secret desire is to have very soon a sort of Europan in Africa.
Yeah.
Because I really hope it will be possible to
There
have
will be an Afropan.
Afropam, yes.
It's my mind since a long time, and I think giving the opportunity to local architects and students to express themselves in showing alternative ways could be very, very powerful. So we
Great.
should build the spaces of representation of the alternative imaginaries.
Right. Well, thank you. I think this is a great way of wrapping up our debate. It was really a pleasure for me. So thank you so much, Dick, Laura, Francesco, Leslie, and Alessandro. I think the debate is not concluding. It doesn't conclude anything, as all the debates open more questions than they actually answer them, which is why we are here. So hopefully we can continue the discussion somewhere else. And well, thank you so much for making it to this debate.
Thank you so much.
And I pass it, the mic now to Javier.
Thank you all so much again for this lesson on translation. I just want to say that tomorrow we are back again here at Palazzo Moro with a different topic. We will be talking about the future of biennials. I don't know the future of biennials or what biennials have done or what else can be done. Simona Galateo, who's here with us already today, is preparing it. She will be the moderator. And before leaving, I just want to say thank you very much again to the whole team of the European Cultural Center, everybody here and the people behind who have been helping a lot on something which is actually not so easy to organize. So thank you very much and see you all tomorrow. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Great job.
Okay, so
Okay.
is mics off? Huh? Can we now? Now we deserve prosecco.
Yes, discussion.